You're listening to Manufactured with Kim van der Weert
and Jessie Li, a podcast about sustainability and the making of fashion.
Join us every week in conversation with the people who manufacture what we wear. Last week's episode was a conversation with co-host Jessie Li about her time with a third-party quality inspection company. This week's episode is a continuation of that conversation, this time focusing on her second stop along the fashion supply chain when she worked in-house for a brand as a merchandising manager. She paints us a picture of the delicate equilibrium merchandisers must strike, caught between designers seeking last-minute changes, factories fed up with those last-minute changes, and the financial pressure to negotiate lower and lower buying prices from factories year on year. Too often, this balancing act results in unsustainable outcomes for all involved. Jessie contrasts this more typical picture with her own experience, where building relationships founded on trust took priority and resulted in better outcomes for all involved. We explore the enabling conditions for trust, like having the right internal structures within brands, and the immense potential of merchandising teams for opening up communication between factories and brands. We also explore subcontracting. Jessie's experience working for a factory willing to talk openly about its subcontracting practices is pretty unusual, and a direct consequence of the relationship her team built up with the facility. She shares how this led to better outcomes for everyone, from quality to on-time delivery to social compliance. We wrap up the conversation with some open-ended musings on the fundamental tension between risk and trust. As sustainability advocates and as an industry, how can we shift from a culture obsessed with minimizing risk, whether financial, reputational, or otherwise, to one focused on systems that give trust the best chances of success? So, Jessie, you experienced a lot of conflict while you were working for a third-party inspection company, as we detailed in our last episode. So tell us a little bit about your decision then to move on to a brand.
So that all this conflict make me think maybe work on the other side, on a higher position of supply chain, let's say on the brand side, could be easier or could be much more peaceful. Less conflicts, let's say. So when I had the chance, I moved to Shanghai, worked for a French group. At that time, they own 5 garment brands, probably more today. So at that time, the whole buying office, the whole buying function was in France. So we were.
Can you just explain a little bit for listeners who might not know, what's a buying office?
Okay. Buying office is interesting. Buying office is so I might just briefly explain the whole process. It might help for the later context too.
Okay.
So first, brands would have a designer team or would have a buying team, depends on the setting. They will estimate the trends of the market, and they will quickly, sales department or finance department, depends. Sales department would quickly work out a budget of the next season. Then the buyers or designers or buyers and the designers will take the figure of the budget, worked out how many connections or how many styles needs to prepare to fulfill the shops. And then from there, they can perform the sales forecast. They can carry out the sales forecast. So the buyers and designers will work on how many connections, how many styles, and then break it into sizes and colors. And then the buyers and designers were focusing on collections and styles development. They don't focus on the actual communication with production side.
Factories.
Yes, factories. So buyers and designers, will pass this this purchasing plan to merchandising team. And that is the role I was going to play at that moment. I was a merchandising manager in China, in Shanghai, to do the communication with factories to make sure factories can produce those goods on time with the quality grade and with the cost grade. So that is the role of merchandising team. Basically, we are purchasing. We are the bridge between.
So you're a representative of the brand, effectively.
Yes.
To to coordinate and communicate with suppliers, with factories about what needs to be produced, how many need to be produced, when they need to be produced, and to make sure that they are capable from a quality perspective to actually produce it.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. And the factories here mentioned are not the brand's own factories, are independent factories. So our suppliers. Yeah.
So yeah, and actually that's a really important thing to distinguish, because I think, people who haven't maybe spent a lot of time thinking about the fashion industry don't really realize that the companies who are making these clothes are not owned by the brands themselves. So the brands need a merchandising team that sits in the middle that basically acts as the liaison.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like a bridge, functioning like a bridge.
A bridge, yeah.
Yeah. So when I accepted this offer, I was quite happy. I was thinking, now I'm moving to the higher part of the food chain, let's say.
Yeah.
I'm going to say how brands work. So I don't have to get involved in those conflicts anymore, the conflicts between factories, inspection companies, and brands. I'm going to work standing out as representing brands. So I accepted the offer and I started work. And very quickly I found out it's not better. Let's say it's different. It's just different. So as a merchandising team, we actually receive pressure from both sides. We have great pressure from buyers and designers of the brands. And we have great pressure also from our partners. Yes. The suppliers.
The people producing your goods.
Yes, exactly. So the pressure from the buyer and the designer's side are mostly on timing. On timing, because you see, they work on the sales forecast, and the sales forecast related to the estimation or related to the trend reports, let's say.
Yeah, it's like, let's say you could explain it, I think, very simply by saying it's an estimate of how many pieces a particular style a brand expects to sell, right?
Yes, and they expected to sell at this price to gain that much profits. So It's all projection into future. So you can understand once they finished, they pass to us. We started the next process, and by then, if they realize maybe they are too optimistic, or maybe they are too pessimistic, or maybe they want some more modifications in terms of good sales and so on and so on. So they would like to change the styles. They have strong motivation to do so. But
to change the styles or to change the forecast, or both?
Sometimes could be both. Sometimes
you mean
could
like
be both.
If, let's say, the t-shirt was blue and then they decide they want to make it red. Is that what you mean?
That is quite rare. That is very rare. It's more often like they make it quite clear they want 2,000 pieces of pants, or they want 20,000 of pants breaking into 5 colors, something like this. Mm-hmm. And then they suddenly realize, no, actually, one color may be not that good for sales. Then they might want to either reduce the colors, which is a big thing, because by then the fabric is probably dyed.
It's purchased and dyed, yeah.
Yes, or better, maybe they think, we are too pessimistic. We want to increase the colors, which increase the quantity, which is good news for factories. However, once you miss the time window, it's quite tricky to increase quantity. It means you're
right. You've already ordered all of your materials. I mean, if you have 5 colors, you've ordered 5 colors of the fabric from your fabric mill. And suddenly to add another one, sure, you can do it, but you can't. I mean, it's very difficult to get it out then at the same time as all the other ones.
Yes, because all the machines or people are all occupied by the already made planning. Yeah, they are booked. Yeah. And then you don't want to ship out 4 colors first and ship out 1 color after. You would like to have all the pants ready at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight that why a factory wouldn't want to do that. Why wouldn't you want to ship out 4 colors first and one color later? I mean, it would significantly increase your logistics costs, right?
Yeah.
Never mind the extra environmental cost of doing extra shipments.
Yeah. And yes, it's also, for instance, you have some urgent orders, you want to cancel some booking, make some new booking, then you have extra cost to the fabric mills and maybe extra cost to the, container. And so on each loop, the working load is increased. When the working load increased, it means your labor cost, the time cost, everything is also increased. So increasing the quantity or decreasing the quantity is actually means the same thing to the factories. So they don't really like it. They like it, but they like to increase quantity, but depends on when they receive the news.
Right.
So this
changes are hard work.
Yeah, changes are hard work.
You can put it that way.
Yes. I totally understand as part of the company, I totally understand we need to be flexible so that we can adapt the markets much better because we have shops, we have our own shops, and we have sales to consider. Yes, we need to be flexible. However, that's the consequences to the lower side of the supply chain. The consequences pass down. When it arrives at factories, it might increase lots of cost and lots of pressure, let's say. So this is the first pressure we have from designers and the buyers. They, let's say, almost over 50% of the time, they want to change this after we told them, sorry, we cannot change it.
Product is approved, it's in production, its cutoff is passed, right?
Usually we set up a very clear rules for everyone. So usually we will remind them once, twice, 3 times or 4 times to tell them, hey, next week is really the deadline. If you want any changes, please do tell us before next week. But it didn't happen like that.
And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said the risk is passed down the supply chain, because the drive for these last minute changes, that's where that comes from, right? There's an unstable market demand. We don't know what's going to sell, what's going to be popular. And so as we get more information about that, then we request last minute changes to products and to production to be able to adapt better to what the market has indicated it might want. And it's really the factory that bears the consequences of that. It's interesting too, because it makes me reflect, like, you know, as a factory manager myself, was basically it was at times very difficult for me within the own like factory management team for which I was responsible, to create like cohesion. Because all of these last minute requests from our customers to do, you know, for a small change here or a small change there, once it was, you know, already been released to the production floor, caused a lot of stress on the system. And, you know, within my own team would cause people to get really angry with each other and to blame each other. And so it was really hard to, like, you know, for example, between the production team and the product development team, the production team would say, why did you allow the customer to make this change? You know, it's causing us all kinds of headaches on the production floor. And now they said they want this change, but actually it's not even clear what that means because we don't have this information and that information. And how are we supposed to do it? Right.
Yeah.
And that created a lot of friction within our factory and within our management team that, for me, as the sort of leader trying to coordinate all these moving pieces, was often very difficult to manage and to keep my team basically working as a team, you know?
Yeah. It's at the beginning of the loop, it just sounds a very small change. I want to add one more color, or I want to change the thread color or something like that. But in the end, when it passed to a factory, it can cause lots of conflicts. It can, as you described, it can cause internal conflicts between production team and the communication side, no matter it's
which
PD
ultimately don't serve the brand, right? Like, it's in those, I mean, I can guarantee you, like, when, as in the factory that I managed, that the times when we had the biggest quality issues and the largest number of defects was when, against our better judgment, we accepted last minute changes, which then caused all kinds of chaos on the production floor and all kinds of friction in terms of internal relationships within our team, that basically led to outcomes which didn't really benefit anyone.
In this situation, everyone would be highly stressed because you have a deadline, you have a boat or a flight to catch up with. Then you cannot be of course you are stressed, then many things could happen. All these small mistakes or those small things changes. So
the bigger maybe lesson to draw from this too is, or the point to articulate is, I think there's a lot of pressure to be adaptable, to be flexible. And while those are good things, I think there also needs to be a recognition of what goes into making a small change possible and how actually a small change is usually a big thing. And then sort of a more, let's say, balanced decision-making process, or a way to have a conversation about whether this is worth it. And I give an example. As a factory manager, I would have loved to be able to discuss with my customer and say, like, we can do this, but there's pretty high chance that it's going to go wrong. Is it that important to you that you want to go ahead? And maybe they say yes, and maybe they say no. But I, as a factory manager, could never have had an open conversation with my customer about that, because I would have feared basically being perceived as unsupportive or unwilling to make something happen for them, and that then I was going to lose the order as a result.
Yeah, you probably will be marked as not cooperative enough. So next season,
Right.
they probably will put you into another list of suppliers.
Right. When that urgent, extreme circumstance becomes the normal, well, then it's just like you're sprinting all the time. And at a certain point, you're exhausted.
Yeah. If the communication can be opened for both sides, brand sides and the factory sides, then the work can be done much easier and smoother. The results are usually better. For instance, if brands could be more open to inform their own planning, let's say, or schedule, then the factory actually can give lots of good and valuable advices about when needs to prepare which part. Or
if I had a way of gauging how important is this change to a brand?
Yeah. Yes.
Right? Is this a top priority, or is it a less of a priority? Because I don't get that information. Every change request that I get has to be treated equally, when in fact, maybe that's not really true.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And yeah, sometimes.
And I can't ask because, like you said, I'll be marked as sort of like a difficult customer, right?
Yeah.
Or a difficult supplier, sorry.
That is something we did at that moment as a merchandising team from the brand side. So this is the pressure one pressure we receive is last minute changes.
And I think the nice way to just wrap up this conversation on last minute changes, I think, is to connect it back directly to sustainability, because our listeners might be wondering, okay, so we have a lot of last minute changes and this is clearly not a good thing for the factories, but what does that really have to do with sustainability? And what I would say to those listeners is that this system creates a lot of extra waste. It creates a lot of extra quality defects, and brands are very particular about where their logos are allowed to end up. There's a lot of checks in place to avoid counterfeits, or to avoid, let's say, defects ending up on local markets. Brands are very protective of their brand. And so these defects have to be incinerated or go to landfill. And on the other hand, the other consequence of these last minute requests and last minute changes too is the extra burden that it places on capacity, which Jessie articulated so clearly. And the question ultimately becomes also, how will factories resolve that? And it creates incentives for cutting corners, whether at the factory level, who is suddenly trying to deal with a lot of extra work and might need extra people to do that, or might need extra overtime to get the order out on time, or even at the raw material supplier level, who might also be incentivized to cut corners. Okay. So the second pressure you faced, Jessie.
And the second pressure is even bigger, which is negotiating the price, negotiating the cost, let's say. So for brands, it's buying price. Yeah. So every season we have to negotiate, beginning of the season, we needed to negotiate the buying price of all the products we're going to purchase. And that gives us a lot of pressure, as I can explain it this way. So for a brand, they believe business needs to, if a business runs very well, it has some growth every year. And that is represented as lower cost and higher price is not very possible, but a lower cost, it should be possible. So at the beginning of every season, we would receive the budget or receive the target, which is always lower. Our target buying prices is always lower than the last season, which give us lots of pressure, because in the past 10 years, let's say, or even longer, the labor cost or the material cost of China is increasing all the time.
Increasing, right.
Yes, so you have the material cost and the labor cost increasing, where at the same time, for factories, their selling price is decreased or compressed by merchandising team or by buying team or by brands. Then it's very difficult. So it gives us lots of negotiation pressure.
And it's worth just pointing out quickly how directly tied this is to sustainability too, because if your wages are going up and your labor costs are going up, and yet the pressure that you're putting on factories is to supply at a cheaper cost, I mean, again, another incentive to cut corners.
And that I would say, I will have to say, related to the policies set up inside of the brands. For instance, in that group, the bonus of buyers and designers are directly linked to the sales performance. How much sales figures they performed, they achieved, is directly linked to their own bonus, or even their maybe some salaries, or maybe their own performance evaluations. So in this case, buyers and designers, they have to negotiate good buying prices for the sales team. So those are the two pressures we had from the buyer side, from the brand side.
Right. And we haven't even gotten to the pressure from the factory yet.
Yeah, pressure from the factory side. Pressure from factory side, actually, if we can have a good communication with factories, if we could establish a trust connection with them, a lot of things would be easier. For instance, after 1 year or sometimes, we eventually establish a quite smooth communication with factories. They could inform us sometimes in advance, like they are fully booked now. So if we have some urgent orders, we better either tell them now, either negotiate with buyers. They could give us a lot of very valuable advices. So with those advices, we are able to make the work easier, to cope with last minute changes and to cope with the pressure from lowered prices. For instance, they would tell us, if you can change this material, it looks, both materials will look more or less the same. However, the cost will be quite different.
Will be different.
Or they will advise us to change the workmanship, or change the cutting, or change the sewing, or do something eventually. It doesn't influence the outlook, but it will bring down the costs. That opens an interesting chapter of understanding at which moment the power shifting between brands and factories. So for instance, at which moment factories are on a much stronger position than brands. At which moment? So in my eyes, that is the moment when brands just placed the order and factories didn't start produce yet. And that is probably the only moment a factory has a stronger position. Why? When a brand placed the order, it means they didn't place the order. They didn't book another factory. So they didn't book another factory. If this factory reject to produce, then the brands missed some time of production. So it means the goods, no matter who produce, will be late in the shops. So it means in markets, this brand will lose some sales opportunities. So when brands just place the order, that is the moment brands are exposed in a more vulnerable situation, and factories are on stronger positions because factory didn't upfront a lot of cost. Let's say factories didn't invest more than they can afford yet. So that is the moment the factories are in a stronger position. Then once the production started, factory gradually, unfortunately, moved to a weaker position, and the brands, day by day, brands gain a much stronger position. So when everything finished, waiting for the inspection report, that is the moment the factory on a very weak position and the brands on a much stronger position. Think about it.
Right.
Factory already produced everything. What can they do if they don't sell to this customer? Other customers will not take, other brands will not take products from this brand, right? So back to the topic. What's the motivation of the suppliers to share all this information with brand purchasing team? Well, they don't have to, in fact, and sometimes hiding those information might benefit them. I'll give you an example. Imagine right now, there is one factory received 2 orders from 2 different customers, 2 different brands, but 2 orders were not secured, or one order is secured, the other one not. The factories might want to pick up one order, but reject the other order. So, of course, the factory wants to secure one order first, to make sure they have one order. Then they will say what they do with the second order. So in this case, hiding the information to say we might be fully booked is actually good to the suppliers. It totally depends on the communication they have with the 2 brands. So as a merchandising team, if we have good connection with factories, if we have trust in between, the factories might directly tell us we probably will be fully booked. You might want to place order to other factories, not to us, not wait.
So how do you earn that trust, though?
I think probably because this merchandising team is located in China. So we know the situation much better, or we receive information much faster than the brands, than the buyers and the designers. And we worked with factories very closely, so we understand their positions, we understand their requirements or their challenges. Yes. So sometimes we would, or we have to advocate their interest in front of buyers and designers. For instance, if they push some changes or some workmanship which is not doable within that cost, then we have to act out. It's also our responsibilities to tell them what is possible in production site and what is not possible. So by doing so, act out based on reasons, not exactly based on positions. I think that's the reason we gain the trust from suppliers.
So, for example, like if they say, one way you can gain trust is by taking the time, when they give you feedback about, okay, something is possible or something is not possible, to take the time to understand why, and also to research it, to validate it, to make sure that, what they're telling you is true. And then basically being in quite a strong position to advocate on their behalf with people like your colleagues within the brand, right?
Yes, I think, First thing, very important, is our attitudes. We didn't see suppliers or factories as liabilities, as you said, or as tricky players, let's say. We really see factories as our partners, as our very valuable customers, because we really rely on them to finish production on time and with good qualities. So this is the first thing. Our attitude is very clear. We see them as...
And do you think that's unique to you, or do you think that most merchandising teams, that this is true of many merchandising teams across the fashion industry?
It's not very true. Unfortunately, it's not a general fact, actually. Lots of merchandising team, if they are in the same company as brands, they usually take positions over reasons. So they use positions, they
use their position, like their action is based on their position within the supply chain rather than based on let's say
a general interest
might be reasonable.
For everyone. Yes, reasonable, or a general interest for everyone. After all, on the final point, both brands and the factories want to ship out goods with a good quality. So I can't say everyone act like that, but many merchandising teams, they act from their positions. They see themselves as representative of brands. So
And why do you think your team was different?
It's a very good question. Can I say because we are good people?
Well, maybe. I mean, I think leadership is an important part of the picture, right? And the tone that leadership sets. But also, I'm curious if
Oh,
you know,
I think I know now.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
I remember the reason.
What's that?
It's because of the manager of representative office at that time. I didn't realize that because this representative office manager is very special.
So the manager of the brand that you were working for, the manager basically they have these representative offices closer to the sites of production, and then there's a manager for that office, right?
Yeah. I have to brief a little bit because the setting might be not general for every brand. So the title of the office is representative office. However, in terms of operation, it's quite powerful and independent from big part of the organization chart. So we are fully responsible for all the products purchased and produced in China. So the title, though the title is just representative office manager, the position or the responsibilities are much bigger than that. You can consider it's like CEO of an independent company at that moment. So I would say the company culture is very different. The office culture is very different. So since the beginning, when he set up the merchandising team and when he set up the tone of the communication, he made it very clear. He wants to have a flat organization. It means there are not lots of authority levels, so flat internally, and he wants an equal partnership with all the factories. So in this way, we could have a much easier, much more efficient, and much more effective communications. So we don't have to argue for several days on something quite small. So in this way, everything can work much better, much faster. So the culture is set up in this way. So when we started to set up the team, when we select people or interview candidates, we also focusing on the culture or building up the team spirit in this way. So in the end, we could have smoother communication. I would say it's because the attitude at the beginning and the attitude reasoned back to the culture we set up. So that's
really interesting. And that's a really, I think, clear and concrete example of a structural change that you could make within a brand in terms of how you structure these representative offices, and also what kind of people you put in charge of them, and sort of the incentives and incentive schemes that you set up that sort of create a culture that's more conducive to equal partnership. But you could change nothing else and only change that, and it would already have a big impact.
Yes. So the setting of context or the setting of the environment is very important. Like you said, the structural change, it can decide many, many things after. We try to copy exactly the same way of communication with our own with our colleagues, let's say with our buyers and designers. However, it was really difficult because as I explained before, their bonus or their performance are bounded with the sales figures, and the sales figures bounded with the market situation. So in this case, they have to often do something like last minute changes or decrease buying prices every season, even it's not reasonable. You see, so that's why we cannot copy the exactly same thing inside of the company, as this is something out of our control. But we managed to have a smoother communication with factories. I should give an example to explain the benefits of the trust communication. We have compliance requirements, not exactly as strict as some certificates, but we also have quite good compliance requirement.
And for our listeners who might not know, compliance here refers to social compliance, which is a term we use to refer to how well a factory does in terms of honoring its commitment to its employees and to its workers, and providing a safe and healthy working environment where employees are treated well.
And one of the requirements is the supplier signed contract with us should not outsource production to other factories.
And the reason why brands might not want their factories to outsource to other factories is because it makes monitoring social compliance a lot harder. Contractually, the agreement remains between the factory on record and the brand. And if that factory on record decides to give part of the work to a third entity, Well, the brand has no oversight of that. That third entity is effectively invisible. So how can a brand control or monitor social compliance in those facilities?
In the situations that material cost and labor cost increase every year quite dramatically, yet the selling price of factories are decreased every season also dramatically. And also peak season comes. So sometimes they have no choices. They outsource production to smaller factories, let's say.
Yeah. And I think it's worth also explaining that even if all of this wasn't happening, even if costs weren't increasing and prices weren't decreasing, there's still a reason why factories might want to outsource, and that is an unstable demand. I think the simplest way to explain it is consumers, people who are buying clothes, sometimes want more clothes and sometimes want less clothes. For example, Christmas time is a peak shopping season for consumers, and people maybe buy more clothes then than they do in February. And so when you're dealing with fluctuating demand and fluctuating markets, you need to be able to produce based on market demand. And, as a factory manager, you have a couple of options for doing that. You can choose to have a huge pool of people on your permanent contracts as part of your staff and have them sitting idle for the times that you don't need them. But the margins in the fashion industry don't really allow for that. And you would go out of business, I think, if that's how you tried to cope with that fluctuating demand, right? The other option that you have for coping with that or for dealing with those fluctuations are, short-term contracts. So hiring people on contracts which are not permanent, or as subcontracting. So working with partners who have the ability to basically be like an overflow facility when you're in your busy periods.
Yes.
It's just a fact of life that sometimes consumers buy more and sometimes they buy less. And okay, to a certain extent as a factory, you can do things to try and balance. If you have longer lead times, you can do things to try and smooth out your production so that you do more. You produce extra inventory in the periods when you're less busy that you can sell during the peak seasons. But even then, it's highly unlikely as a factory that you could perfectly smooth out your production so that, every month you produce the same number of pieces.
So factories, they have their reasons, and I have to say very reasonable, to outsource production, sometimes partly, sometimes quite a lot fully to another factory. And usually factories, they will hide this information or hide this fact to purchasing or merchandising team for their own good, of course. Though even though this is an open secret in the industry, outsourcing is really the open secret in the industry, they still want to hide it, which is very reasonable.
Well, and I think it's an open secret, and it speaks to something really pretty fundamental, right? Which is that brands historically did do their own manufacturing, right? And struggled with exactly this issue, which is how do you balance an unstable demand and all of the resources, the staff that you need to have on hand in order to be able to cope with an unstable demand. And how did brands solve that problem? Well, with the advance of improvements in communication technology and logistics, it suddenly became possible to do production elsewhere where not only were wages cheaper, and I think usually the emphasis is put on cheaper wages, but for me, that's only part of the story. But also you can basically outsource that risk and the risk of those costs to someone else. So the fact that we have a brand and a supplier who are not part of the same company is because, one of the reasons why we have that is because of an unstable demand and a desire to outsource the risk of those costs, right? And so then suddenly when we talk about sustainability, we come in with permanent contracts and, all of those things are really important for protecting workers' rights. But I think it's almost like we have to acknowledge the original sin. And you know what I mean? And how the fact that we have this kind of setup in the first place is pretty directly tied to this problem. right? And the fact that the brands have outsourced it to somebody else doesn't mean it's gone away.
Yeah, no, it's not just passed down the chain.
Passed to someone else.
Yes, and accumulated somewhere lower the supply chain, lower part of the supply
Right.
chain. Yeah. So factories, of course, have very good reasons to hide the fact. However, it increases the risks on the purchasing side. So on the merchandising team, for instance, if they don't tell us they actually outsourced production to another place, then we might miss the time to check the goods on time. So that we might miss the time window to do something, to know the truth of the product's quality. So for us, we have very good reasons to control the situation, to at least acknowledge where exactly those goods are produced, so that we can send out our own quality people or even ourselves to go to the site to really see it, to know exactly which stage those productions are. Like already.
Right, and that the quality is good and that,
Yes, and understand the conflicts or the challenges a factory is facing. So if there is something we can help, we will. For instance, they might need us to call the third-party inspection company to come earlier, or we might need to arrange to book the inspection company later. After all, they cannot book inspection company, only us, only we can. So those kind of communication or information sharing can benefit both sides, but can also just harm the suppliers, harm the factories. It depends on our attitude or our positions. So after a few, I think 2 or 3 seasons, we finally have a smoother relationship with some suppliers, not all the suppliers. So one day, the supplier just told us very frankly, saying, we were too busy recently, and we have to have much more orders than last year to make some benefits. So we outsourced
to make some money, to stay alive.
To stay on the table, to not get out of not get kicked out. So they told us that they outsourced our production to another smaller factory, and on the top of that, they even agreed to show us that factory. So eventually, our merchandisers went to the original plan is our merchandiser will go to this supplier to check our goods. But eventually, this supplier showed us the outsourced production, outsourced factory. So we went there. We were able to see the real situation of the production. That really helps a lot. So now we have the real information. We can feed back to the buyers or suppliers to tell them if it's still possible to add one more color, or it's not possible, or anyway, you are late because of the last minute change. But anyway, don't worry. We can give you a schedule plan, shipping schedule plan, which date you might have how many quantities in your shops and so on. So this kind of cooperation really benefits not just, let's say, merchandising team, but also the shops and the buyers.
And what happened when you went to see that subcontractor? I mean, were you obligated as a merchandiser to disclose it to the compliance team that this factory was subcontracting, or how did that work?
It works usually more like it's very flexible. Yeah. Sorry.
Did you have like a sustainability department that you had to report to that this factory was subcontracting, or did the sustainability department have to go out and do a compliance audit, or how does that work?
That is very interesting because that is the setting of a brand usually. Compliance department or sustainable team, their responsibility is to select or approve a groups of suppliers who are compliant. And after that, their jobs or responsibilities are done. If we don't, if we or a third party don't report those supplier is not compliant, then their responsibilities are actually done, finished. And our responsibilities is.
And I guess from a technical perspective, contractually, nothing has changed, right? The supplier is still the approved facility.
Yes.
Even though you know that they're subcontracting.
Yes. So in fact, what, the name stayed on the compliant supplier list, or the name stayed on the official supplier list is this supplier, but the actual production could happen in a totally different facility or location or totally different companies, or factories.
And so what happened when you went out to visit that facility?
I was quite surprised to see the conditions of that subcontractor factory was actually quite good. I mean, it was clean. Everything is organized. it's not a workshop. It's a real factory.
Right. But I think then the point to highlight here too is in some cases they're quite good and in some cases they're not. And how as a fashion industry do we deal with that, right? And like, because basically like what you said, this production facility is invisible. And from a contractual perspective, they're invisible to the brand. And so, you know, if a brand wants to take an active role in ensuring that their production facilities are compliant, you know, what's the best approach here? Is it that they should actually also have to go to that subcontracting facility and do an audit? Because, like you said, in this particular instance, it was quite a good facility, but in another case, it might not be. Or is it, again, coming back to trust? Probably the strongest determining factor that sort of made it likely that this subcontracting facility was compliant was the fact that they had been selected by a supplier in whom you had some trust.
Yeah, that's true.
You know?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. In this case, I would say I hope or I expect, let's say I expect brands could deliver some power to their compliant suppliers. Yes. And this is the meaning of trust. I mean, if you choose these suppliers because of the technique, because of the capital, because of the capacity, because of the compliance for so many reasons, then you should deliver some power, some decision power to them. Let them decide if they shall outsource some production for their own goods.
And if they're willing to take on that risk, right?
Yes. After all, once the contract is signed, all the risks are actually on the shoulders of the factories. I'm not saying brands don't have risks. They have if the production is not finished on time. They definitely has risks. However, factories also have lots of risks. And don't forget, they upfront so much cost of money and labor.
Right, that they're not going to send their products to somebody who they don't think is going to get them done on time.
Especially, yes, exactly.
And get them done in the right way.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Because ultimately, if they're exposed, then they will hurt. They will be the one who bears the consequences.
Yes, in the very practical consideration, actually factories, they do think all these risks because they are the one carries all the risks, not mentioning they already invest so much time, materials, and people, and all this cost inside.
Right.
So I would expect brands could deliver some decision power to the factories. And I'm not saying all the factories are honest. Let's say sometimes in those days, sometimes we didn't have information actually, but thanks to the culture we set up in the company and thanks to the partnership both sides eventually set up, we still could receive information. We couldn't go there to see the production, but we kind of know the production is outsourced or not outsourced. And we kind of know we can more or less believe or trust that the factory who outsourced production will take care of the quality or will treat quality seriously.
Right.
So yeah,
and social compliance too.
And the social compliance too. Yeah, I have to say that because as factory in China, factories usually set up in villages or in the suburbs of cities, let's say. And so usually the factory owners or factory management and workers, let me say it this way. Usually the factory management or the factory owners are the relatives or maybe their families are the villagers already. So they live in the village. So this is also a social
part
pressure.
Of the community.
Yes, they're part of the community. So it's kind of social pressure that they also care a lot about social compliance and
their reputations.
Yes, and reputations
within the community, which is in contrast to say somewhere like Cambodia, where a lot of the garment factories in Phnom Penh are not owned by Cambodians, right? And they're owned by their foreign companies coming into a foreign country, setting up a workplace in a community which by definition they're not part of. And I think, is the conclusion from that that we should draw from that to say, oh, we should always put factories, in rural places or in places where the factory management is part of the community in which it's geographically located? No, not necessarily. I think it just goes to show that, different contexts and different social relationships and ecosystems within which a factory might exist does affect the way you might go about talking or thinking about social responsibility.
Yes. It's not as simple as that. For instance, I said many China factories actually set up in the villages, and the factory owners or management are the villagers, part of the community anyway. There are also many big factories they set up far away from nowhere, let's say. So the locals and the factory management or the factory workers, they are not from the same community. Then the social pressure or the social how you call that? Yeah, social attachment, let's say, is much less and much lighter. Then it's easier to have some problems. But however, when we talk about textile, in some locations, in some big provinces, they are usually located right there. So when we talk about outsourcing, or when we throw out a judgment based on morality or based on those consciousness, I think we really need to think about the context. So in which context we are discussing those big topics, and in which context we could make a judgment. Yeah.
Right. Oh, there's just so much food for thought, I think, in your experience.
If my first job experiences makes me realize how important trust it is. Trust basically is a guideline to help us or protect us when we worked in some gray zones. If this is what I learned from my first experiences, then my second job experiences, working as merchandising manager for brands, that makes me realize even more that trust connection or trust relationship can benefit everyone in the loop, actually, not just protect the factories, but also help the purchasing team and also help benefit the brands in the end. If the brands could allow factories, give some spaces to factories to give their own advices and listen to them, allow them to get involved into the decision making, even just a part of it, it can eventually benefit brands. Yeah.
And I think maybe it's like, I'm thinking about this, I might not be very articulate, but I think people ask me, I've received the question a lot, like, well, how do we get trust? And I think the challenge is trust fundamentally involves a certain amount of risk, right? Because trust can always be broken. And that is like inherent to the very idea of trust, is that it can be broken and it's fragile. And so when we talk about the perception of suppliers as liabilities, or we talk about sustainability as a strategy for minimizing risk, or we talk about different players within the supply chain seeking ways to minimize their risk, on the one hand, that's understandable and a logical course of action. But on the other hand, it very much is counter to trust. And that doesn't mean being reckless and going totally crazy, but it does mean being willing to put your faith in another party and to be open to the consequences that might come with that, and what we should focus on perhaps is putting in place structures that instead of trying to minimize that risk, sort of like give that trust the best chance of succeeding.
Yeah.
Or of not being broken.
What you said just to point to a very fundamental question, actually, that is, in my eyes, is top management is the policy maker of a company, or a company culture maker, let's say. So what you mentioned just now, totally related to what kind of environment we want to create in a company. let's say if a company focusing on cost effectiveness, then for instance, a brand wants to buy a jacket at $1, the supplier wants to sell the jacket at $1.5. So if the brand really cares, or let's say only cares about profit and cost, then there's no cooperation, there's no trust, because once again is once lose, right? And if as factory manager or as the management of a company, if the performance is completely linked to the figures, financial figures, then it's very difficult to allow someone else making mistakes. So what I want to say is it's really, there are lots of things brands could do, or the top management could do, which is create a more sharing environment, create a more equal environment, that the risks or the performance risks could be shared, and the performance is not only evaluated by financial figures. Then that might cultivate lots of trust. Yeah.
Yeah, big questions. And we certainly don't have all the answers, but hopefully just starting to articulate the questions will help us to get thinking about, well, where do we go from here?
Thank you for listening to Manufactured.
To learn more about our guests and the issues we've chatted about today, check out our website, manufacturedpodcast.com, or find us on Instagram at manufactured_podcast.
We'd also love to hear your stories and what you think. Collecting with listeners is the most rewarding part of what we do, so please don't be shy. Leave comments on Instagram or connect with us privately through our website.
From June 16, you'll be able to find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. But in the meantime, you can subscribe on our website for the latest episodes.
Thanks for listening, and see you next week.